What's up, everybody? How's it going?
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Anytime. Thanks for coming together at the spur of the moment to talk about a data contract battle royale. So, Ethan, I think to kick things off, I just want to share I think this is what kicked it off. I'm pretty sure. But you had a post. You're talking about. You said data contracts kill innovation. Great way to start a conversation, by the way. So, um, but we can get into this post in a bit. But yeah, I mean, I'll start with Ethan here, since you said they kill innovation. What is a data contract?
Totally. So when I think about interfaces between teams within the organization, and a lot of this terminology, some of this terminology will come from Chad, some of it I might be butchering. But you have people that produce data, and the two biggest data sources that I see within an organization are engineering teams, software developers with operational databases, and IT departments that manage SaaS applications on behalf of stakeholders within the organization. Salesforce, Zendesk, QuickBooks, et cetera. Those are the biggest data, places where data is being produced within the organization. And then you have consumers. That could be your front end application for your business, like the website that people actually access. But it could also be, in a lot of respects, an analytics team and an analytics environment. Something that is being used to build dashboards for better decision making. It could also be an operational workflow. Automatically take data from your product database and reverse ETL it out into your email service provider to send an email. So it's these downstream consumers that are either powering analytics, dashboards, operations, like automating manual tasks, or actual products that people want to buy. There are companies that there's data in their database, they sync it into a warehouse, build a dashboard, and then literally sell that to customers for money. So in my opinion, the contract is an interface by which those consumers, whether it's an analytics team, an operational data flow, or a product developer downstream trying to build dashboards or operational workflow products, are going to an upstream producer, an application or a database, software engineering team managing a database, and saying, let's align on the interface that you're going to give us data, and we're going to consume it. And that piece is what I'm thinking about when I think about a data contract.
What about you, Chad?
I mean, I generally agree with that.
God damn, somebody start a fight here. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, well, a data contract is just a data-based version of a real-world contract, and a real-world contract is just an agreement between two parties where there's something that we want to happen, and there's some mechanism of enforcing that it actually happens. And so a data contract is a similar agreement, but it's between someone that produces data and consumes data to vend a particular data set, which usually includes a schema along with like some mechanism of enforcement. So I differentiate the data contract, which is what is the data and how do we enforce its quality, from the data product, which is like, why do we need this data? So if I'm building a machine learning model, then I have a very clear use case, right? I'll understand what is the data I need, why is that data actually needed, how is that data going to be used, what's the problem that we're solving with that data. So aligning on the data product, which is what I need for my model, and then agreeing on the contract are two separate things. I just wanted to make that clear.
So here's the part I disagree with. Got to keep it interesting, Jeff. So when you think about when I think about interfaces inside of an organization or within or between organizations, but let's keep this conversation for now to within one organization. You can kind of imagine a team. Let's say you have two people on a team. There are a couple ways to manage that team. Number one, you have two people. You're like, great, go figure it out. Use whatever tools you want. Here's your goal. Your goal is take Jenga blocks and build the tallest tower. It's like, great. I don't care how you do it. Just solve that problem. Option number two is you take those two people and you split them out and say, you do this and you specialize here, and you do this and you specialize here. And we're going to put an interface between you. And now person number two, your job is build the tower. Person number one, get the Jenga blocks to the second person. Probably not the Jenga block analogy broke down pretty quickly. But the question of like, once you put that interface in place, if it's wrong, like now you have this contract that you've agreed to, this interface that's there, that in reality, those two people should be aligned around the vision. They should be aligned around building the thing at the end. And if everyone's on board with that, yes, there are interfaces and communication that need to take place, but it's all in service of a business goal. And I think too early in the process of anything, standardizing interfaces and saying, great, I'm an engineering team, all I have to care about is this interface, not the revenue we make from that data product, is the problem, and where it starts to add friction. And like open source, a similar scenario where you expose interfaces too soon and then you're stuck. You can't innovate without breaking those interfaces, and it slows things down. So that's the problem that I have with data contracts is that they're focused on those interfaces, and an engineer can look forward and be like, yes, I have my 5 interfaces, things work great, and not think about how do we drive the most revenue for the company? How do we automate the most workflows to save us time? And actually start brainstorming, breaking down the barriers between these teams and processes.
Okay, yeah, I think that's an interesting conceptual point. So the question I would ask is, do you think an interface has value?
I think an interface has value as it's used more and more. So like my most of my job right now is I build against APIs. Like I interface with interfaces every day. I build an API integration every about 2 days at this point. And it's great if you know what it's being used for. Like what a lot of people don't realize about APIs is they say, yes, expose an API, it'll magically solve everything. But APIs need to have a use. Like what is the point of the API? If it's make it so someone can build a user experience on top of your API, REST or an asynchronous API might not be the approach. Maybe it's like GraphQL might be ideal for that. If it's analytics, like I interface with APIs and it is an interface, but it's definitely not the interface I need to be able to extract data and load it into warehouses seamlessly. So when I think about interfaces, it's was it the right interface for the use case, the specific downstream value that's being created? And now you have another layer that your engineering team has to maintain. Like all these, like I integrate with APIs where I'm like, yes, that's amazing. And I go back to the company. I'm like, hey, can you add another endpoint? Or like, can you make this work? It's broken right now. And they're like, oh, we expose that API. Like if it doesn't work, like good for you. Like we're back over here doing the thing that we were going to do. And like they use it as a way of getting people away from them instead of collaborating on solving the problem. So in certain scenarios, when you see the same use case 1,000 times, it makes a ton of sense. But I think premature interfaces stall innovation.
Okay, so I think we can come back to the what stalls innovation point in a little bit, but I just wanted to get clarity on like interfaces are useful. There are when you understand I'm just sort of parsing what you're saying here is when you understand exactly what you want, then the right interface can be incredibly valuable. And a contract is a form of interface. And the way I try to understand what I'm hearing from your point is that before you understand like what your data product actually is, then having this like hard interface can be a blocker to iterating quickly. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Definitely on that. And then the second part is thinking about the interface as the objective, as opposed to like a second tier aspect of how do we accomplish this goal together. Like the interfaces, in my opinion, should be fluid. It should be something that you can evolve and say, oh, maybe this wasn't the right interface. Maybe it's this, because that could be an easy way of solving the problem. But yes, at the highest level, what you just said.
Sure. Yeah, right. I think whether it's fluid or not is an implementation detail, and like that's something we can talk about as well. But the next thing that I want to understand is like, where in your mind do you see the dividing line between when you need a contract and when you don't? Because to me that line is very clear. And like where I think an interface becomes valuable is where data quality is important. Like when data quality and some form of like CI/CD process and governance is meaningful, it has an ROI impact on the data work that I'm doing. Like that's probably a use case where a data contract is super impactful. If I don't really care about quality, like if it's not that big of a deal to me, right? If the interface could change at any time, I drop a column gets dropped, some values change. And it's like, okay, like I'm doing some analytics in a Metabase dashboard or a mode dashboard or something like that. Cool, fine, whatever. Like maybe my data is wrong for a few days, but I'll have to write a filter and I'll correct it. It's no big deal. That's probably okay. But if you're working with Amazon's, let's say, recommendation system, that's probably not a situation where you can afford to have a broken interface.
Correct. And here's where I would distinguish there, though. I don't think you need an interface if you have one data producer and one data consumer, where it's very well known what the objective is. Like, they both want quality there. And like, if you're the data producer and you have a field in your database and you know it's being consumed for one purpose and one purpose only, you can do that in a quality way, just like you build any other product. Like, there are a lot of companies that have operational databases that power their front end, that power other parts of their application, that like, and they can have the insight into what's going on. Where a interface makes a ton of sense is as you add more consumers, or as you add more decentralized producers, where it's like external APIs are a great solution when you do have 500 different people all trying to extract data for analytics from one place. Like, you can no longer keep in your head what is going to break. So I think quality is part of it, but quality in a way in which it cannot be managed by human beings is the second piece there. I think there's two points on that.
The first thing I would say is, even if you have a producer who is producing something for the explicit purpose of a consumer, you still want a contract. Right? Like, you should still know, okay, you have a separation of responsibilities. You have a software engineering team that is generating a certain amount of data. There is some expectations, and I want to guarantee that anytime there's a regression, that we catch that. And the only way that we can catch that is by clearly defining, right, what does a regression actually like mean to this consumer. And so you can work together, or even on a single team, to produce that. But there should probably be like some element of a contract, even if it's just, hey, here's the data that we're going to be sending to your model. We've both agreed on what that data is going to look like, right? Like, we probably wouldn't ever be in a scenario, I would imagine, where like not having a contract is a good thing. It's hard for me to find a scenario, but that's like, it's better for us to not have an explicit agreement on the data that's being provided.
I haven't answered that, but Matt, I think you're muted, but also trying to talk at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a slight difference of terminology reading the LinkedIn discussion. So I think, Ethan, you were defining a contract to be something very static. Like, you agree, the two teams agree, and then it's really, really hard to change it. And I think, Chad, you were kind of defining the contract as something that it's more like it changes slowly. So in other words, stuff could change, but both sides have to agree, and any changes that aren't approved get blocked in version control, basically. But if there's a good reason to make a change, then you can change. You just need to like get sign off from the other side of the agreement.
Yeah, exactly. It's a relationship. I don't see a contract as a set of like static values that is, a database is locked into providing like these columns and only these columns, and I can never drop them, I can never change them. I think that would be that's something that engineers would be very averse to in the first place. So yeah, I see it as an iterative surface for interaction, where a consumer can go to a producer and say, hey, this is the stuff that I need. My world has changed. Let's come to an agreement on like whether you're willing to provide this new data to me or not.
Totally. So and I agree with that. And having a definition of an interface there is useful. Having a conversation there is extremely useful. That you cannot live without that part. The part where I see a downside of having a producer-consumer contract that is, I'm the consumer, I want this data in this format, and I'm a producer, sure, I'll get you that data in that format, is the consumer, specifically thinking from an analytics team perspective, isn't the actual consumer. So like, the data analytics team at the company is not the one looking and making an actionable decision off that dashboard. It could be someone else. So like an example of this would be, we're gonna have a very basic example here. I'm the data person. My job is write SQL and build dashboards that impact our business. My goal right now, I wrote some queries, found out that we want the top 10 largest customers at our company listed on a dashboard so our CEO can reach out to them every month and upsell them, because we know that is really important to our business and really impactful. So there are kind of two options here. Number one, we sit down with the software engineers and say, hey, this is the data we need because our CEO needs this dashboard. And that's the goal. The goal is give them a way of understanding the top 10 largest customers and why. The second option is the consumer, the analytics person, distills that business use case that, hey, we need the top 10 customers into a rigid schema, or not rigid, into a schema that can be evolved, but into a schema of fields that is then a contract with a producer. And if you think about something that might live in that schema, like if I'm the analyst there and I don't want my dashboard to break, I'm going to go to the consumer, the producer, and say, I want company domains. Like for every one of our top 10 customers, give me the company domain that they're associated with. If a month from now, the producer starts sending me legal entity names, that's going to break our contract. I'm going to have a problem with that as the BI person, the analyst. But it has zero impact whatsoever on our CEO's ability to reach out to those companies. So when I think about the goal here, it's like that is something that should be very, very fluid. And like if both teams are aligned on, hey, we need a way of building a dashboard for the CEO to reach out to top 10 customers, rigidly enforcing a schema upstream of that is not the actual true end consumer of the data product is the part where you end up with these discussions and these conversations that, especially in a one-to-one relationship, one engineer, one data consumer, and then an end user, like there's friction there that doesn't need to be there to solve the end business use case.
Yeah, so I think the way that I would imagine that situation should be handled. So first of all, if we have a data contract, the explicit assumption is that whatever the end mode of consumption is like very important to us. And these properties or this like schema that I'm getting from the upstream is important. If something's like fundamentally not important, then it probably shouldn't be a part of the contract. And if it is important, then it doesn't mean that a software engineer, like you said, can't evolve it, or they can't iterate over it, or they can't make changes to it. But there is now a surface where that conversation needs to happen, right? So if I'm just going to take a property that already exists and I'm going to significantly change it beyond what was intended in the contract, I think that that's like a good conversation to have. And we can then decide, right, between the producers and the consumers, like, okay, you can make this change and it actually isn't going to affect us all that much. So go ahead and do it, right? We can update the contract. So like, this isn't really that big of a deal anymore. The problems happen is where you have sort of what I was referring to as like, non-consensual contracts that are actually being implemented all over the company with reverse, ETL, like ELT today, right? Where someone's basically saying, hey, I want to pull some data out of a database and I want to use it for some production thing that's really meaningful. But my software engineer doesn't actually even know that I'm doing that. And so when they make a change, now I get broken, right? Like that's what we want to avoid. So having the communication where we can like just talk about these things and use the contract as like the vehicle for collaboration, I think is super important. And if you decide that, okay, well, maybe it's adding too much friction for like some particular set of properties, or even for this dashboard, maybe we don't need a contract here, right? Maybe we're okay having a lower amount of data quality and we can explain it away, or we can like do some, fancy magic in the warehouse and filters and things like that.
What do you think of as the threshold, like when you use the word data quality? So use the word data quality as the key threshold for a data contract. And yes. I referred to kind of the relationship between number of producers and number of consumers, making that a much more complicated relationship to manage when you have a small data quality issue spread across 10 consumers. How do you think about going from, hey, great, like we have a top 10 list of customers for our CEO, like honestly, you probably don't need a data contract there, to that's being used for financial reporting and Sarbanes-Oxley is involved. Like what do you think of as the steps and the thresholds at which someone should go from thinking about it as that's just data for ad hoc purposes to the next phase, which is informal contract, to the next phase, which is like super rigid, to the next phase, which is like you will get fired if you break this? Like what are those thresholds that you think about?
Yeah, well, so I would say it's a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum are the things that we know, like they could totally change tomorrow and there's zero business impact, right? So we kind of have an idea of what definitely doesn't need a contract. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we definitely know the things that like absolutely 100% need a contract, right? Like Amazon's recommendation system, Convoy's pricing model, if a single column of that breaks and our training data breaks, like you could be looking at $1 million of business impact like relatively quickly. So we sort of know the tail ends, and then in between is where people need to use their best judgment. The way that I prefer to think about it is like, if you can tie quality to return on investment, you probably need some sort of contract. Right? If I can say, and there's like a lot of abstract ways that you can apply that, but if I say, we make critical business decisions off of this dashboard, and if this data is wrong by 10%, like those decisions could lead to X million dollars of like lost revenue, right? In that case, we might say, yeah, it's probably important then that the data is correct. And for the data to be correct, then we need X, 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 and Y to always be true. And if it's not true, at the very least, we like need to know when it changes, and it needs to be versioned, and so on and so forth. So I think like we know the tail ends, like that's very clear. And in the middle, there is some subjectivity, but anytime something needs to be right, or there's like ROI that's associated with something being correct, I think is when you should start thinking about contracts.
Totally. One of the big points in my post also, in addition to saying data contracts kill innovation, is the idea of the importance of the joint vision. So I used to be a product manager for a while, and you can go to an engineer and say, hey, I need this, like, give me this, it's in the PRD, like it needs to look like this, check these boxes, it's good to go. And it is the fastest way to get an engineer to shut down and to do no work, because they have no reason why. They have no idea why. They're not understanding what the actual impact of it is. It's very easy to blur the line between a use case and an implementation detail that engineers don't want to be told implementation details. And one of the best ways of aligning a product manager with an engineering team is the goal. What is like the joint, like what are we actually trying to accomplish for a customer? Like the best way to get a engineering team aligned with why something should be done is put them in front of the upset customer, put them in front of the person who's willing to spend $1 million if they make a change. And so to me, when I think about data contracts and kind of the way we've discussed them, even up until this point in this conversation, it's around that interface between the data producer and data consumer, and then the joint vision and the alignment is somewhere else. How do you think about where does that come into play? Like, is that part of the data contract process? Is it a different process? Because to me, you can have the best contract in the world, but if there's no clear joint understanding of why, like none of it matters. So like, how does that fit into the model in your opinion?
Yeah. So I will answer that. I wanted to address this at the beginning, but I didn't get the chance, like the comment on innovation. So I'm just going to take like a very quick detour to speak to that. So I think the reason that I disagree with the point that like data contracts slow innovation is because innovation is actually like very multidimensional, right? Like there are certainly avenues of innovation that are more closed off if you start applying contracts to your data. So for example, being able to freely explore all of the data that's being pushed from my databases, right? Like there might be some data that's not relevant to me or that is not included in the contract. And if I don't get that, then I'm potentially missing out on some opportunities to do like fun exploratory analytics. And certainly that is sort of a mechanism for and iteration speed and some of these other things that you mentioned as well. But I would say that innovation can also come from being able to find and use trustworthy data quickly, right? Like if you can find the data you need quite fast and you can use it and you believe in the results, I would say that that's a really big boost to innovation velocity. Having data that's well modeled, I think everybody on the call can agree, is like a tremendous boost to innovation velocity. And if you're leveraging contracts, it's actually a great time because like the contract is based around what the end consumer actually needs and not necessarily what is just being, what the service cares about. It's a great time to do all of that, like very valuable modeling. And then also like just being able to do experimentation and trust the outcomes, like all of that. So that's sort of what I'll say about the innovation piece is like, I think that sort of the iteration speed and like doing exploratory analytics is a part of it. But there's like other parts of it. And so you kind of have to use both in moderation. So anyway, back to the point that you asked, which is starting with the why and aligning with the why. I think that is I think that is like partially important. And the reason I say partially is because, yes, it is very valuable for a producer to know how their data is being consumed. Like, it does add some color. It helps them understand, like, oh, this is the reason why I can't just like drop this column in my schema. But to go to the point that you actually brought up, where if you're a producer that has many different consumers, you probably don't have the mental bandwidth to understand the potential like hundreds or even thousands of applications of the data. So at Convoy, we have a team that produces all of our auctions data. And that data gets used in like multiple different machine learning models. It gets used in like various dashboards. It's actually used in products. So having to go through a very clear alignment for every single use case with that producer team is probably going to be beyond their scope. They actually don't want that, right? What the producer wants, they want to say, here's a set of trustworthy data. Here's a schema that is useful and valuable to the entire company. And if you need something added to that, then we can have a conversation about like why it's meaningful and why you need like this particular property or whatever. But what you do with that data is not really my business. My job is to validate that it's like meaningful, is to vend this to the entire company, and is to ensure that it doesn't break. And like what I found is like that's the type of relationship engineers want to have with data folks.
How many consumers of that data set are there? The auctions data specifically. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect, but like to that point, it seems like that's at one end of the spectrum of like there are so many consumers where the only way to actually manage them is through an interface. Whereas when you think about much smaller, not necessarily smaller use cases, but like smaller producer to consumer number of relationships, I believe the alignment matters a lot more. So like kind of curious, like, are there other scenarios where inside a Convoy you have a very high value data flow, but it's only one-to-one, so engineers do want to be in the room to hear about why?
Oh yeah. I mean, those types of things definitely exist for sure. And I think that even in those cases, quality is still important. But because there is such a tight pairing between the producer and the consumer, then like it's way easier to actually define what that contract actually looks like. Like it's a very simple, like easy thing to do. Whereas if you're vending something for the whole business, then like to your point, like it's almost impossible to get aligned on every application.
Totally.
Cool. I know we're at the kind of half-hour mark here, Chad. I know you had to have a stop. Thanks for being on. Do you feel like you've come to some sort of a middle ground with the debate, or how do you feel about talking?
I would love so definitely, like there are scenarios like that last example of there's no way to get a producer whose data is being consumed by hundreds or tens of consumers for different use cases on the same page with all those other consumers. At the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of scenarios, especially early on, where it's like produce data, consume it, iterate, like where a tighter feedback cycle makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the big open questions, and maybe Chad, we collaborate on some content around this, is like, what is that life cycle? Like, what are the key thresholds at different points? And then also, like, the last part is like, how do you not only align it with the contracts, like, and to a certain extent, it seems like early in the life cycle, when it's like one-to-one, it's like the vision probably matters more. As you get more and more consumers and you've already like locked down that vision more and more, the contract becomes more and more important because of how many different visions you can be unlocking, and kind of better defining that it is a spectrum and it is an evolution depending on the specific producer-consumer relationship and kind of the maturity of it, is the part that to me is most fascinating out of the conversation.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. The call out that I try to make on LinkedIn is that most, maybe I won't say most, that could be maybe that's sort of an overreach, but a significant number of data sets are probably initially provided for that like one-to-one use case early on in the life cycle of a company. But the problem is, because the contract is like never established, then everybody ends up like taking dependencies on that data. And that's how you get this foundation of just craziness where, now you've got like this data set that's like changing all the time, and an engineer drops like one column and like 200 people are impacted and nobody knows why. And it just gets kind of insane. So maybe another way of framing it is to sort of say like, when in the early stages of a business or in the early stages of like a pipeline, it starts off in a silo, and that's okay. Like it's okay to start off in a silo as you're iterating and you're sort of learning what data you actually need to vend. But once you start going beyond that silo, that's when like the contract becomes really critical. And as soon as you make that transition is probably when you should start thinking about the contract. So
Totally.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, guys. It was a
Thanks for having us.
simple
It's
debate. Yeah. I think we kind of overplayed it with the boxing imagery, but whatever. It's fun.
I mean, we can yell at each other for a little bit if you just want it for the content.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just
Do that next time. We'll record some outtakes or something.
Yeah, get some chairs or something. You can beat each other with them. So awesome. Yeah, glad you guys have a chance to talk. Like I said, it's very. I think a lot of people were intrigued by the conversation. So figured what better way to talk about it than to talk about it. So thanks to the audience. A lot of comments. So it's pretty awesome. And yeah, hopefully you guys can collab on some content. Really would love to see what you guys come up with. So
Love it.
All right, Chad, get back to your whatever you have to do. So all right, see you guys.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Matt.
bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.